And there's some very interesting data from Canada that shows us this and helps us to understand the nature of the virus. And it's also important because we've got 37 million Canadian friends over there as well. So let's start off by looking at Canada today. Then we'll look at some other places as well of interest in a minute. Now, Canada, 66,000 cases, 4,500 deaths. Always look at this in the context of the population, of course. This is 37 million people living in Canada. Now, 55% of the cases recorded in Canada are female, 45% male, and 36% are over the age of 60 years. Now, I actually don't think this is relevant. I think this virus infects everyone equally. I think the disparity here probably reflects testing in Canada, because I don't believe there's more females infected in Canada than males. And likewise, all ages are affected. But it is interesting that the Canadians have come up with this data. Now, trend-wise, the Canadian authorities are saying, which of course I'll post the link to, new cases continue to be reported across the country. However, the rate of increase continues to decline. But of course, this still means that the total number is increasing. And I have expressed concerns about Canada over the past few days. And the Canadian authorities are saying the number of illnesses in Canada is continuing to increase and has not yet peaked. So unfortunately, we are going to see more cases, and that's going to be associated with more deaths in Canada. Now, I wanted to show you some of the very useful illustrations from Canada here. Now, this one is the Canadian epidemiologists have recorded the distribution of COVID-19, 33,000 cases at the time this data was collected, as of the 7th of May, in terms of age distribution. So they find that there's less young people here, less people aged 70 to 79 here, more people in the 40 to 59 age group. Now, the question is this relevant? And the answer is, I don't think it is. This virus affects all ages equally, I believe, is the data that's emerging from around the world, in that all ages can be infected equally. But of course, we know the morbidity and the mortality is massively different in different age groups, with older people suffering more severe illness and much more likely to die than young people. Although, having said that, young people can get serious illness, and we have been concerned about this inflammatory syndrome that's been documented in Italy, the United States and the UK. But as a general trend, it's the older people that are getting affected more, but everyone, I believe, can be infected equally. And of course, that means all ages can transmit the disease equally. Let's just look at this without me in the way. Yeah, this is good. So this is the number of cases in various regions in Canada. So the darker the blue, the higher the number of cases. And we see the numbers recorded there. So a very useful graphic here from the Canadian government. So we see that most cases are in fact in Quebec at the moment. Fewer cases there in New Brunswick and a few more in Nova Scotia. Ontario we see as a medium dark blue. Manitoba and Saskatchewan less. Alberta and British Columbia, the colour speaks for itself. Going north to Yukon and Northwest Territories, fewer cases, and Nunavut, no cases. I don't know if anyone's living in Nunavut at the moment. I mean, I imagine that Baffin's pretty cold this time of year. So, but I thought that was interesting that they give this, did I mention Newfoundland? I can't remember. Fewer cases in Newfoundland. So it's quite useful that the Canadians seem to be giving that geographical data in such an easy to understand form. Now, this is the probable exposure. So the probable exposure is how people contracted the illness in Canada. And they believe that about 19%, or fairly accurately 19%, that they can trace epidemiological links to foreigners that brought or travellers that brought the virus into the country. But 81%, as we see here, is in the community setting. And of course, this is very significant because we've seen this everywhere. It starts off as individual cases, then clusters, then there's community spread where it's not possible to trace an epidemiological link. So that means that there is this ongoing community transmission in Canada, as indeed, unfortunately, there is pretty well everywhere in the world now, with few exceptions. But there are a few exceptions, such as Taiwan, South Korea. So community transmission, as unfortunately, is the norm now. Now, this is an age group, percentage of COVID-19 cases with detailed cases information that are hospitalised and admitted to ITU. So this is the proportion of people in a particular age group that are hospitalised. So, for example, if we take the 50 to 59-year-old age group, we see that 15% of cases are hospitalised, and 5% of those required intensive care. Likewise, in the older age group, we see that 42% of people infected were hospitalised and 11 required intensive care. And even in the younger age groups, we're still seeing some hospitalisation, but the darker blue representing those that require intensive care. Now, this is an incredibly significant set of data because it is fairly consistent with other countries around the world. And that means, I believe, we can expect this trend to be repeated in other countries around the world. Now, this is by gender, the percentage of COVID-19 cases who were known about that are hospitalised and admitted to intensive care. So again, as we would expect from data from other countries, and it's always good to get this confirmed, in Canada it was 13% of females infected, hospitalised, 3% in intensive care. 19% of men, 5% in intensive care. So again, we see men are getting more hospitalisations than women, and more men admitted to intensive care than women. And again, this is the pattern we've seen around the world, that men are suffering more severely from the disease and dying more from the disease than women. And I think this is the final Canadian graphic. Again, interesting. The red lines are the doubling days. So doubling time of cumulative number of reported COVID-19 cases in Canada. Again, for 63,000 patients. So this is very high quality data. And we see that doubling time was slow in the initial stages. But then when community transmission became established around about here, then we got a great increase in the number of cases. So the early days of community transmission around about there are getting doubling times of down to 3 days. 3 days, 4 days doubling time. So without the lockdown measures that were instigated around about this time, this rate of doubling could have carried on increasing. It's been slowed by the community health measures that Canada has taken. Now, other interesting information coming out of Canada. This is symptoms and severity in Canada. So again, getting this confirmed is good. So of all the people that were examined and the clinical information recorded, those that tested positive, 74% had a cough. And this is, again, is fairly consistent with what we've been seeing. 56% had headaches and 54% had weakness. Now, we know there's other features as well, but again, these were the most common ones. Interestingly, it doesn't mention fever there. I'd expect the fever to be round about the same as the same incidence as the cough, actually. But that's, again, it confirms. And most of these, of course, were dry coughs, as we got in the initial cases, as indeed Etta suffered from in yesterday's video. 3,500 people hospitalised, 827 in intensive care in Canada. So interesting things in Canada there, very largely confirming what we know, but we know that this is recorded by high quality statisticians, by high quality epidemiologists in Canada, so it's highly reliable data. and it tells us fundamental things about the virus.